Alright, I will try to clear up some confusion about all this. So basically there are two cases. And the first case I'll be talking about is how it's normally set up with the BMS. Okay? So the BMS, it sits inside the battery pack and it's a non-perishable part, unlike the fuse. Okay? This will be the first case. When the fuse is a last line defense. Yeah? Okay, so the energy goes, all the cables, or how it sets up. So it goes from battery through the BMS, then it comes out of the BMS and it goes into an inline fuse. From an inline fuse we have cables going to the controller. Then all of that energy gets carried through the cables into a motor. So this is how it usually sets up. Okay, so this here is 100 amp continuous 270 amp peak battery pack. Choose different color, green. Okay, and the BMS is 120 amp 300 amp peak, and this is how it should be set up. The BMS should be rated a tiny bit higher than the battery, what it's capable of putting out. It's the reason is because we want to avoid hitting the limits of the BMS all the time, because it can turn up spontaneously. Okay, alright, so that goes into a fuse which is much higher rated than the BMS. It can be close, but it'll be a tiny bit higher than the BMS. Okay, and then we have a controller which will be matched. There's spaghetti going on in this image, but then the controller is basically matched to the battery. Okay, I hope you're keeping track of all this. All right, so there will be also, the controller will have high voltage and low voltage limits and a current limits set accordingly to what battery can deliver. And the BMS is just sitting there with its limits also set tiny bit higher what the battery can deliver. But then again, it's also higher rated to avoid the need for thermal cutbacks. Okay, so this is still the first example. So if something goes wrong, if the motor or the controller poops out, yeah, the BMS will sense it first. Then, if for some magical reason it fails, the fuse steps in and it blows. Yeah, it saves the day. It basically saves the battery from going into a thermal runaway because the motor or controller failed. Yeah, so that's where that's when the fuse is last line of defense. Number 3, 2, 1. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about case number 2, which is what usually happens when the Surround guys, they modify their bikes and they bypass the BMS, so we don't have BMS anymore. That's it. It's completely taken out of the equation. That's it. Done. gone. So all what they have left is a circuit breaker, and now it basically acts as a BMS, and it is the first line of defense and only defense basically, because there's yes, controller can help with current limits, but if it fails, and the motor also, like something like shorts out, that's it. And there have been cases when the circuit breaker welds shut, so there's no more protection. That's it. Basically, battery is getting shorted out. No, okay, yeah. The controller on the battery is getting shorted out, and there's nothing to save the battery from getting drained and going into the thermal runaway. Okay, so for example, if we this is still a second case, so we still have the BMS is still out of equation. So what happens if we don't have the circuit breaker? So this is when the fuse becomes basically a first line of defense, because there's nothing else. It should be in the place of the BMS. It should be acting as a BMS, but that's a yeah. And it also what I've maybe forgot to mention, maybe I don't know. This is a perishable part which is much easier to replace than the BMS. Yeah. Okay, but that's different. Yeah. So this is the second case, and this is the only case where the fuse will be first line defense, the second line of defense, or yes, the controller can also be first line of defense, but yeah, how you configure. So yeah, this is my 50 cents basically. I hope it helps. These are the two cases, and in one case it can be the fuse or circuit breaker or the BMS. Also, how you configure the controller, it can also kind of help, but it's not an actual, shouldn't be an actual failsafe.